Hey yo, we're going to learn some styling today on the web. To style web page, you are going to use or need something called CSS, which is short for Cascading Style Sheets or Cascading Style System, or as referred to by the great Douglas Crockford, crappy style sheets. But before we understand how Cascading Style Sheets, also known as CSS, works and how to write them, we're going to, oh yeah, you guessed it, go back in time a little bit. In the early days of HTML, you used to just build HTML. And if you wanted to style something, you could just give it a color. So what's wrong with this approach? Imagine I have a blog about the ocean, and I decide that the background should be some kind of blue. And I write a blog post, and I write another blog post. Well, let me show you what's going to happen. So I'm going to create a new file near my index.html, maybe call it blog1.html. And let me just copy my index, paste it here. I'm going to get rid of all the content. Just leave a paragraph in an image. Maybe add an H1 and say my first blog post. Right? And now if I go back to my project folder and I open my blog, there I see it, my first blog post. Now, we said that I want the background to be blue since it's about the ocean. So I'm going to say bg color equals, and here I can enter a value for color. This value would be this hexa value, which is just a short code for blue in hexa. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to refresh the page. And now it's blue. Now don't worry if you didn't understand why this number maps to the color blue. We're going to talk about it later and I'm going to explain to you. But for now, just bear with me. Now I decide that I want to create another blog post because I have something interesting to say. So I'm going to create another new file. I'm going to call it blog2.html. I'm going to paste the content here. And I'm going to say my second blog post. I'm going to go back to our project and I'm going to open this one. And there you have it, my second blog post. Well, this is all nifty and cool and very nice, but suppose it's Independence Day now and I want to change my color to red. Well, I have to go back to my second blog post and then to my first blog post and change them both. And now it's red. But imagine that I have hundreds or even thousands of these pages. Now, to go back to each of them and change it would be crazy. It would take so much time. That's not a good solution. Furthermore, if I wanted to center the text, let's look at maybe this paragraph. I could wrap it in a tag called center. Let's do nice and dense so it looks pretty. And I'm going to go back to my first blog post. And I'm going to refresh. And as you can see, the paragraph centered. This is also very wrong since I'm now clutter my HTML document, which is supposed to be the structure of my document, with extra tags only meant for design. This is exactly where CSS comes. We need the ability to separate the structure of the page from the design of the page. In fancy programming talk, this is also known as decoupling. This will solve the problem of my blog, even if it had thousands of posts. And will also solve more modern problems such as displaying your content on different screen sizes and platforms. And making your content responsive for mobile and stuff like that. And don't worry, we will obviously cover all those topics later also. As HTML grew, it came to encompass a wider variety of stylistic capabilities to meet the demands of web developers. Before actually going to see how CSS works, let's add the CSS itself to our page. Let me just delete these blog posts. Go back to our index. The first way to add CSS is open a special tag called style. I'm going to add it to the head part. The browser will read the content of it before it displays the body, so it will already have styling. But just keep in mind that I can also do this inside the body, and we're going to talk about the difference in later tutorials. Right now, you can add the style here, and here I can start writing CSS. But I'm not just going to do that yet. Second way to add CSS is with a special attribute that I can place called style. And I can place this attribute on the body or on inner tags as well, almost anywhere I choose to. The third way is adding an external file, which is a CSS extension file, and importing it in the page. And this is the most correct way, and we're going to do that but we're going to do this later. For the sake of demonstration, we're going to start by just doing it the first way. We're going to add a style tag at the top of the page. Let's talk about CSS syntax. There are two terms we need to understand here. The first is the selector, and the second is the CSS property. Let's start by imagining a bunch of Mr. Potato Heads in a row, right? And a crate full of Mr. Potato parts sitting by you. In order to style them, I will have to select a specific potato head, and then I can decide which accessories I want to put on it. The same goes for CSS. There is two parts. One is the selector, used to target specific elements of your HTML page, which ones you would want to select and which one you want to style. And once you select those, you can style this element by adding properties. So maybe start with something simple. I can write a P, which is a tag, or short for a tag selector, which will select all our tags P in the document. In our case, all the paragraphs. Next, I have to open and close curly brackets. Curly brackets are also on your keyboard, usually near your right side of the keyboard on your enter. And you can open and close one. They are not used too much, except for weird smileys and in programming. Now, after I have a P and an opening and closing curly brackets, between these brackets, I can start placing tags. I clicked enter, so I have some room. Here, let's place a tag called background color. And I'm gonna just set this to yellow. Now, if we go back to our document, let me close blog 1 because it doesn't exist and blog 2 doesn't exist, and I just refresh index, you can see that all the paragraphs now have a yellow background. So that's it. That's the basic of CSS. We styled our page, we selected all the paragraphs, and now they're yellow. Another quick example, on the bottom, we have H1. And we're gonna try to do the same so you see it works. So try it with me. The attribute itself we want to select is H1. The selector for H1 is called also H1. So I'm gonna describe it by typing H1. Then I'm gonna open a curly bracket. This time, I'm not gonna click enter just so you see everything in one line. And I'm gonna say font weight to be bold and font size to be, I don't know, 70 pixels. PX is short for pixels in CSS. Now, as we said before, in this case, I wrote the entire CSS in one line, but the computer doesn't care if it's one line or two lines as long as it's written in correct syntax. But you care. So let's start by making sure it looks nice and clean. I'm going to click enter before the font weight, so it's going to be in a new line. And then I'm going to click another enter before the font size. And then I'm going to click another enter before the closing curly brackets, and shift tab to make sure it's indented in the correct places. And here you can see how CSS is formed. After I have selector and I open and close the curly brackets, inside these curly brackets, I can place a lot of properties. In this case, I placed the font weight property and had it set to bold, and also the font size property and had it set to 70 pixels. So let's save it and look how it looks. And as you say, now H1 is bold and it's much, much, much bigger. I could also add a color to it. Let's say aqua. And refresh. And now you can see my header is in aqua. So I can have as many accessories to my Mr. Potato Head as I want. Before we dive into a little more advanced topics about CSS and actually start using and styling stuff that is meaningful, let's talk about another two really useful and popular attributes in HTML we're going to use. They are called ID and class. And what do they do? Well, I'm glad you asked that. They do nothing. You might be confused. What the hell am I talking about? What do you mean they do nothing? Well, they're used to identify specific elements. Think about it. If I give each of my Mr. Potato Heads a number, an ID of some sort, I can later say this special accessory goes to this Mr. Potato Head. I can know which Mr. Potato Head I want to style exactly. So let's go back to our document and go to the first P. I'm going to place an ID tag in it and call it first pair. And then I'm going to go to my second paragraph and add a class called big para. And I'm going to copy that and put it also on my third P. Now, if we're going back to CSS, and here you can see where the magic happens, I can now target specific elements with IDs. So if I want to go to this specific paragraph where I put my image, I can target it with an ID. So I'm going to start with a hash sign, which tells the CSS language that my selector needs to select an element with an ID and put in the ID I gave it, first paragraph. Then I'm going to open and close curly brackets. And inside my ID selector, I'm going to say the background color is going to be blue violet. And I'm going to go back to my page and refresh. And as you can see, now I get blue violet. Now I can also select the classes from my CSS selector. So let me just use that with the dot notation. And I'm going to say big pair. As you can see, putting a dot in front tells CSS language that I want to select a class, just like the hash sign is used to select identifiers. Now, inside the middle of the curly brackets, I'm going to click enter, so I have a lot of rooms. And I'm going to say font size should be maybe 40 pixels, and font style should be italic. Now, as you can see, only the second and third paragraphs were affected by this, since they are the only one who were selected because they are the only one who had the correct class on them. For some of you, all this rendering may have seemed trivial, but for some of you like me, you might be wondering what the hell happened here. We're not going to dive into the specifics of the browsers too deep, since it's one of the most complex programs that exists. I actually use to run about 90% of what I do every day through the browser. But here is what happened from a very high level view. Remember, we talked about the browser actually needing an HTML or a page to render. Well, the correct term for this is called a DOM, which stands for Document Object Model. And we will talk a lot more about the DOM. But in general, the browser parsed your DOM into small chunks. If we want to be more specific, these chunks are spread out in the form of a tree. Tree in computer science is a data structure. You can have nodes, and each node can hold a connection to other nodes. And it kind of looks like this. It gets its name from being similar to how roots of actual trees look like. So here is how the tree of our document looks like. The root is always the HTML at the top, and each tag that it contains is a node. In our case, I'm going to close it so you can see. We have the head and we have the body. The head itself had a style and a title. I didn't draw the style, but you get the idea. And the body had a header, which itself had a node of an anchor. And then it had a few P's, horizontal ruler, and etc. After that, it also parsed our styles. It took the CSS and took every selector and made a chunk out of it. And the content of this chunk was the styles themselves. So basically, we have a bunch of Mr. Potato Heads. This is the DOM. And we have a bunch of accessories to give them, which is the CSS. So the browser just took the correct selectors and attached the correct chunks of the CSS to the correct parts of the DOM. And this is obviously an oversimplification of what happened without going to too much computer science terms like parsing and compilation and the tree data structure. But if you want me to talk about those stuff, feel free to leave a comment and I will dive in. Going over a quick overview of what happened, we parsed the HTML, we parsed the CSS, we created what is called the rendering tree. After that, the browser placed the boxes in the correct location. This is what is called a layout. And then we painted the screen. So now that we understand the basics of how things look under the hood, we can start styling. So everything is neat and dandy, and we learned tons from how browsers, engines work and render stuff all the way to tags and attributes, and we learned CSS selectors and properties. But you're probably saying, dude, this page looks like shit. Well, don't worry, we'll find a nice design and actually put our knowledge to good use. But before that, we're still missing a few key concepts. Remember I said the website has a phase where it layouts the elements? Well, we're still there because real pages still have a lot of structure to them. They have a lot of layouting to them, and we still need to learn the basics of layouting. You will almost always have elements such as navigation, top bar, header, footer, a place for the content, drop downs, and much, much more. This largely increases when you go from static websites used to display content into interactive applications such as Gmail or Facebook or anything you want to build. And remember, this tutorial is about a web application, not just a web page. So in order to build these structures, we're going to learn how boxes work and appear in the DOM in CSS. Unfortunately, you will need to pay attention. This is the trickiest part, because of everything we've seen so far, and probably one of the trickiest we are going to encounter through the entire course. But before we go into it, let's go back in time a few years. So in the early days, both the DOM and CSS were horrible to code in. It was a hostile and hard environment. It was hard to move stuff around. People used to style web page in tags that are meant for tables. That was, I think, in the late 90s. Then we moved to concepts such as floats. I hope none of you got to use it, but it was horrible. So working with this kind of CSS felt like pulling random wires and hoping everything will fall into place. Today we have a lot more useful tools such as CSS Grid and CSS Flex, and almost every browser today supports them completely, and they are commonly used. So we're going to go over those concepts, and once you get the hang of it, and I'm gonna spend a lot of time explaining the idea and the basics behind it so you can build anything you want. But before we do all that, let's look at the CSS display property. So here we have our HTML. And we have a few tags we created, and these tags already have some selectors and some CSS attributes to them. And each element has something called a CSS property called display. So if I go to display, these are my options: block, contents, flex, flex blocks, etc. And let me go online and see what does this actually mean and why is this so important. So display CSS, I'm going to search Google for it, and I'm going to go to the CSS display property. Definition: the display property specifies the display behavior, the type of rendering box of an element. In HTML, the default display property value is taken from the HTML specification or from the browser user default style sheet. The default value in XML is inline, including SVG elements. So let's look what this actually means. I can give my boxes or my elements, DOM elements, a few properties. And I'm going to go over only a few basics of them. And later on the line, we're going to learn the rest of them. Inline displays an element as an inline element. Also says like span. Remember I said span is inline last tutorial? Any height and width properties will have no effect. This is interesting. So we can set height and width of a special box, but it will take no effect. We'll need to remember that because there is a lot of special caveats using HTML. Block displays an element as a block element, like a P or also what we've seen, a div. It starts on a new line and takes up the whole width. And in this case, it's important to remember that we're going to style the page using blocks, and blocks by default take up the whole width. There's more content. Flex is very important. Grid. Inline block, I'm going to read it since it's very important, displays an element as an inline level block container. The element itself is formatted as an inline element, but you can apply height and width values. And you can do stuff like tables and I don't know. Remember we said that the DOM is a structure of a tree? Well, inherit means inherit this property from its parent element. In a tree, a parent is the node above you, which connects you. So if we look at our page, this anchor tag, right, its parent is going to be the header. And the header tag, its parent is going to be the body. If I go to this header tag and I told him to display inherit, he's going to take the same display as header. And you might understand where this comes in and being useful, but we'll talk about this more in the future. Imagine that this is my HTML page. To draw the page. Beautiful. Now, imagine that I place a div inside of it, or P, and I gave it no content. In this case, then it will have no height, since there is no content to render height in it, and I didn't set any height. But as we said, they are block elements, and they take up full width. In this case, the div will just be like an invisible line. It will have the height of 0 and full width. If I place another div, since they have no height, they're just going to be on top of each other like this, two invisible lines right on each other. So let's try to actually code this. I'm going to go back to our page. I'm going to delete all the CSS. All right. I'm going to delete all the content of my page. And I'm just going to create a new div. I'm going to give it an ID so we can select it and work with it. And I'm going to call it box1. And I'm going to build another div called box2. So going back to our app, Now if I refresh it, this is my page. It's the same one I drew. There's two empty divs up here with width of the full page and the height of 0. And just so you believe me, if you right click somewhere on the page and click inspect, the Chrome developer tools will open. You can also do this by Command Option I on Mac. As you can see, I can see the display of our HTML here, and once hovering over elements, it will also show me them. So the body takes up the entire page. Box 1, as you can see, if I look in the left, I can see its dimensions. So it showed its full width, but the height of 0. Also, box 2. Now, let's play around a bit with this. Remember, to select them, since they have an ID, I need to start by a hashtag and then the name of the ID I want to select. So box 1 would select box 1, and box 2 will do the same for 2. And in this case, I'm just going to click enter and start giving box 1 some properties. And so we tell the different, I'm going to give them both of them some background color. One can be burly wood, obviously, and the other crimson. Beautiful. Now, if I go to my page and I refresh, I still see nothing. Why is that? Since we gave them no height. What happens if we're going to give them both height? If I give the first div some height and it takes up the whole width automatically, it's just going to be here. Now, if I give the second div some height, since it's a block element, and remember we said block element displays an element as a block, it starts on a new line and takes up the whole width. Well, the second one going to start on a new line and take the entire width as well. So let's just give them heights and see how they behave. Beautiful, just like we've expected. Let's talk about another really important concept we use constantly in CSS called margin and padding. So let's imagine that I have this box. This is some kind of block element, and this block element has margins and padding. So what is margin exactly? Well, suppose I want this box to take some space from its parent container. Suppose it's in some kind of another div, which is big, or the body. Well, this is called the margin of a box. It's the space that it will take up to contain from the sides of it. Padding is the content inside the box. So suppose I want the text to be, I don't know, 10 pixels from the top and from the left. This is padding. Now, why are these concepts important? Well, we're going to be using them a lot, and I want to show you how they behave. Boxes also have borders. So in this case, this can be the border of the box. Let's just, for the time being, delete box 2. We're going to use it again in a while, but for the time, we just need box 1. Okay, and we said it has a height of 50, so let's change this to 150. Also give it a width of 150. And remember that containers take up full width, but the second we gave it a width, we overrode the function that gives it full width. And in this case, it's not going to take up its whole parent width. It's just going to take up 150 pixels. Let's look at it. Bam, we have a beautiful square, 150 by 150. Now let's start doing stuff. Suppose I want margin, and I want to give it 50 pixels of margin, and I refresh. You see that the box took 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the left, like we talked about. Now, I would give it padding, but we're not going to see it, so let me write some text in it. Hello. And now we have the text, and it's in the top left corner. Now, let's add some padding to it. Bam. Now the text is padded 10 pixels from the top and 10 pixels from the left. But notice something weird has happened. Our boxes is bigger. If we now try to inspect it, well, you can see the browser helps us and shows us the padding and the content, but it's 170 by 170, even though we forced its width to be 150. So what exactly happened here? In our case, even if we gave the box the 150 width and the 150 pixels height properties, we still gave it a padding of 10 pixels. So it's 10 pixels here, 10 pixels here, 10 pixels here, and 10 pixels here. 10 on the top, 10 on the bottom, it's another 20. The height is now 170. 10 on the left, 10 on the right, and 150, it's the width of 170. That's what happened. When we enforced the CSS property of width, it only did this on the content. When we added padding, it added another width to our element. And this is why we also mentioned border, because if I gave this a border, let's say 10 pixels, and a solid border with a color of red, and don't worry now if you don't understand what this property means or how it works, but this is just a CSS way to add a border to an element. And I refresh, then you say our div grew again. At this point, it's 190. Since it's 150 by width, we've added 10 padding on each side. So now it's another 20, 170. And we've added another 10 pixels of border on each side. So now it's 190. So you can see our div keeps growing. This is important, since if we have two divs in a container and we want them side by side, and suppose this container is 100 pixels and we set each div to be 50 pixels, well, then these two are not gonna be able to stand right next to each other if they also have padding or a border. And we want to understand what happens. And as you can see, if I inspect it and I go to this element, the browser also shows me how this is calculated. It shows me the margin of 50. It shows me that there's a border of 10, there's a padding of 10, and a content of 150 by 150, just like we drew. So that's pretty cool.